In 1995, in a quiet rural town in Colorado, a disappearance forever shook the tranquility of that community. Sarah Thompson, a 14-year-old girl full of dreams and with her whole life ahead of her, mysteriously disappeared after a simple visit to her grandfather's farm. No one imagined that this would be the last time she would be seen in the wild. The case soon became a disturbing mystery, full of silence, neglect, and unanswered questions. Where was Sarah? What had happened to that teenager who suddenly seemed to have been swallowed by the earth? The police didn't believe it was a kidnapping and insisted she had fled on her own. But her desperate mother always knew there was something much darker behind her disappearance. Time passed. The years piled up, and the pain of not knowing the truth became an unbearable burden. The town went about its daily business, while dark rumors circulated, strange noises coming from a locked barn, her grandfather's excessive food purchases, and increasingly isolated behavior that no one dared question. Had Sarah been silenced forever, or was she closer than anyone could imagine? What no one knew was that behind those heavy wooden doors lurked a terrible secret, an unimaginable horror that would only be revealed almost 2 decades later. When the truth finally came to light, it left everyone in shock, provoking tears, anger, and disbelief. This is not just a story of disappearance, it's a story of silence, pain, cruelty, but also of resistance and survival. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is a narrative full of twists and turns, a suffocating drama that will hold your attention until the very last second. Stories like these don't go unnoticed by those who truly feel them. Those here now aren't just spectators. They understand the pain of a disappearance, the anguish of mystery, and the strength that exists when the truth finally comes to light. Every twist, every hidden detail, every revelation matters because it's what gives the victims a voice and transforms pain into living memory. This space is for those who thrill with every suspense, who feel the tension of the unknown in their hearts, and who refuse to let these stories be forgotten or told half-heartedly. So come join this community that values the truth, emotion, and intensity of these narratives. Hit the subscribe button now, like this video, and help keep this chain of stories alive that need to be heard until the end. Sarah Thompson was just 14 years old when her life turned into a never-ending nightmare. Until that fateful day in 1995, everyone saw her as a shy, reserved girl, but full of dreams kept in notebooks hidden under her bed. She enjoyed reading cheap novels that she borrowed from the small-town library, and when she walked home, she always seemed to be living inside her own story, as if she were somewhere else, far from the heavy routine of the farm and the rigidity of her family. Sarah wasn't a rebellious teenager, but she carried in her eyes a strong desire to escape the suffocating control her grandfather exerted over the family. Since her grandmother's death, the once cozy house had become a dark place, where silence reigned and fear was as present as the cold Colorado morning air. Richard Thompson, her grandfather, had a reputation as a tough, rigid, and traditional man. Few dared confront him. To the neighborhood, he was just another solitary, religious farmer of few words, who continued his life tending the land and cattle. But within the family, his figure was much more complex, controlling, cold, and above all, unpredictable. Sarah was afraid of him, but also knew she couldn't show it. She grew up learning to keep her opinions to herself, to avoid questions, and to obey without question. Still, in her notebooks, she sketched plans for a different future. She wanted to study, travel, see big cities, live a life where she could breathe without feeling the weight of her grandfather's eyes upon her. That summer of 1995, everything seemed the same. Sarah had gone to visit the farm, as she had since she was little. Her mother believed that this contact with her grandfather could be important, an attempt to maintain family ties after the death of her grandmother, who had been their closest bond. But on that visit, something changed. What should have been just another routine day in the fields became the beginning of a disturbing silence that would last for 18 years. Sarah didn't return home that night. No phone call, no note, nothing. Just an emptiness that left everyone in shock. The entire town was gripped by the disappearance. Posters began to appear on lampposts. The school mobilized teachers and students. Neighbors went out in impromptu groups to search nearby areas. And Sarah's desperate mother knocked on doors in search of any clues. But there was something strange about how Richard reacted to all of this. He showed no pain, no tears, no indignation. He simply spoke coldly, as if nothing had happened, as if his granddaughter's disappearance wasn't enough to disrupt his routine. This behavior to many could have been simply the reserved manner of an elderly man, but to those who observed closely, there was something off, something that sounded false, almost rehearsed. While the mother begged the authorities for help, the local police seemed uninterested. They claimed that teenagers run away all the time, and that Sarah had probably decided to abandon her country life in search of adventure in another city. This explanation, besides being cruel, undermined any investigative efforts. The case was treated as a voluntary escape, and the mother was left to shoulder the burden of proving her daughter hadn't run away. And amidst this disbelief, Richard went on with his life without anyone daring to suspect him. What few knew was that Sarah, upon entering that seemingly ordinary barn, had crossed a line of no return. Behind the wooden doors, Richard hid a secret that would change everything. He had meticulously prepared that space. Blocked windows, reinforced padlocks, total isolation. To him, his granddaughter was not just a girl, but something that needed to be kept under his absolute control, hidden from the eyes of the world. And so began the captivity no one could have imagined. As time passed outside, Sarah's life within that space was reduced to suffocating silence, constant fear, and a complete lack of choice. At first, she screamed, cried, and begged for help, but as the days passed, she realized no one would come. The barn was distant, isolated, and the few sounds that escaped were lost in the wind. Her grandfather, in his calculated coldness, came and went as if it were the most natural thing in the world. To the town, he was just a lonely man dealing with the loss of his granddaughter. To Sarah, he was the jailer who had stolen her youth. And outside, time continued to stand still. The mother continued to struggle with disbelief, facing the pain of emptiness and the indifference of the authorities. But all the while, the girl everyone believed lost somewhere far away was actually much closer than they could have imagined. Much closer. Back then, in 1995, the days following Sarah Thompson's disappearance were filled with despair. Her mother couldn't sleep, spending entire nights calling friends, distant relatives, anyone who could provide even the slightest clue. The neighbors, in solidarity, organized groups to search fields and forests. Posters were posted in supermarkets, bakeries, and post offices, always with the same photo of Sarah smiling shyly, her light hair falling over her shoulders, and that lost look of a teenager still unsure of what to expect from life. It was the image of a girl everyone believed was out there somewhere, needing to be found. But behind this mobilization was also the cruel weight of disbelief. The police, instead of intensifying the search, insisted on the same cold explanation. Sarah had run away on her own. To them, it was all nothing more than a family drama, and it was in this tense atmosphere that the first clue that something was deeply wrong began to emerge. That same week, neighbors living near Richard Thompson's farm, the grandfather, noticed strange activity. During the night, muffled noises came from the main barn, the same one Richard kept locked with heavy padlocks. Some swore they heard distant screams, but always muffled, as if someone were trying to call for help but were unable to. Others reported metallic noises, like chains dragging, and even quick footsteps inside the structure, at times when the old man should have been sleeping. When questioned, Richard always gave the same excuses. It was rats, it was the wind blowing through the loose boards, it was just the cattle getting restless. The answers were too simple, but delivered with such coldness and certainty that they dispelled any insistence. Besides the noise, there were details that were beginning to bother him. Richard was buying more groceries than he needed. Extra bags of rice, beans, powdered milk and canned goods. For a man who lived alone and rarely received visitors, that amount made no sense. He also began to further restrict his presence in the city. He only came in for quick purchases, avoided long conversations and, when asked about his granddaughter, responded with dry sentences that shut down any attempt at dialogue. It was as if he had built an invisible wall between himself and the rest of the world. Meanwhile, inside the barn, Sarah was experiencing the beginnings of a terror no one could have imagined. She screamed, pounded the walls, tried to find a way out, but only received silence in return. After hours of despair, she heard her grandfather's steady footsteps, entering carrying a lantern and an expression that left no room for compassion. It was at that moment that she understood that no one was listening, that no one would come to save her. To her grandfather, she was no longer a granddaughter, no longer a teenager with dreams. She was simply someone he had chosen to keep under control, as part of his property, hidden from the world. Outside, small details continued to emerge, but they always seemed insufficient to prompt a proper investigation. A neighbor even told other residents that she saw Richard, on specific nights, carrying heavy bags toward the barn. But when she spread this suspicion, she was disbelieved. "He's a man in mourning, he lost his wife, and now his granddaughter is missing," they said. "It's just an impression." And so, any clue that might have saved Sarah was buried by the collective conformity and the image of a respectable man that Richard had cultivated throughout his life. The first strong clue emerged months later. A young man doing odd jobs on the farm said that, as he approached the barn to fetch tools, he clearly heard what sounded like a female voice, faint, almost a whisper, calling for help. Frightened, he told his family, but was soon told not to interfere. No one wanted to get into trouble with Richard. It was as if fear and respect for the old man spoke louder than any suspicion. With each detail ignored, Sarah sank deeper into oblivion. What kept her mother going was the feeling that her daughter hadn't run away. She didn't believe the police's conclusions, she couldn't accept the neighbor's silence, and she refused to give up. She kept repeating, "My daughter is somewhere, and I'll find her." But without concrete proof, all she had were rumors, scattered clues, and a pain that seemed endless. And while the community tried to move on, pretending the tragedy had become nothing more than a distant memory, the barn remained standing, locked, holding within itself the secret that would forever change the family's fate. And the most disturbing thing is that, just as everyone seemed to be getting used to Sarah's absence, new signs began to emerge, clearer, harder to ignore. Small cracks in her grandfather's facade of normalcy were appearing, but no one knew where they would lead. As the months passed, Sarah's absence ceased to be merely a shock and began to transform into a suffocating enigma. For the police, the case was practically closed. A teenager who had decided to run away from home, nothing more. But for those who truly knew the girl, this explanation made no sense. And it was in this contrast, between official silence and maternal intuition, that what would later be called a hidden pattern began to emerge, a web of details that would only make sense when someone had the courage to connect each dot. Sarah's mother was the first to notice that something wasn't right. Her daughter hadn't packed any clothes, taken out any money, or written a farewell note. For a teenager supposedly on the run, it was as if she'd simply vanished. Besides, the town was small, and any movement would attract attention. No one saw her at bus stations. No one encountered her hitchhiking on the highways. No one recognized her in neighboring towns. It was as if Sarah had vanished into thin air. This was the first thing her mother remembered. Her daughter hadn't left voluntarily. The second came with his grandfather's strange purchases. At first, they seemed like coincidences. Bags full of groceries, preserves, extra blankets, even simple medicines. All of this was an exorbitant amount for a single man. His mother observed, but had no proof. Still, every time she saw Richard carrying more supplies, her heart sank. What was he hiding in that barn? Why did he keep that space so tightly locked, as if it were more valuable than the house itself? Soon, reports from neighbors began to emerge. One claimed to have heard on cold nights the sound of chains being dragged. Another said he once passed by the barn and thought he heard someone crying, and although everything was said in whispers, no one took any action. It was always easier to believe it was just imagination than to confront Old Man Thompson. The community's silence became, without realizing it, part of Sarah's own prison. But there was something even more unsettling. People who visited Richard noticed a strange pattern in his eyes. He seemed to bristle when asked too many questions about his granddaughter, avoided prolonged eye contact, and his voice hardened, almost menacingly, when the subject came up. It was as if carrying this secret was both a burden and a source of power, something that kept him in control, even in the face of tragedy. The mother, in her despair, began to piece things together. It wasn't just the lack of evidence of escape. It wasn't just the noises in the barn. It was the whole, the pattern no one wanted to see. While everyone accepted simple explanations, she realized there was something much larger and darker behind it. She began writing down every detail in an old notebook. Dates, neighbors, accounts, strange purchases. She recorded everything with the hope that one day it would make sense to someone other than herself. And it was precisely this notebook that would become the key to keeping the research alive, even when all seemed lost. Within it lay the clues that Sarah wasn't far away, but terribly close. Closer than anyone could have imagined. And with each page she filled, her mother drew closer to the truth no one wanted to believe. The truth hidden behind those heavy wooden doors, where the night wind carried whispers few dared admit they'd heard. But this truth was still buried, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And when it did, there would be no turning back. As the first months turned into years and no concrete leads about Sarah emerged, her mother's only option was to insist on what the police refused to see. From the beginning, the authorities had classified the case as a voluntary runaway. To them, teenagers disappear every day, many due to family disputes, others out of a desire for adventure, and most eventually return after a while. But that wasn't Sarah's story, and her mother knew it with every fiber of her being. The problem was, no one believed her anymore. At the police department, each visit from her mother became a source of impatience. The officers greeted her with weary looks, as if she were just another hysterical woman who couldn't accept reality. Some even insinuated that Sarah might have run away to escape her own mother's strictness, or even suggested that she might be involved in things the family didn't want to admit. These words were like knives. At each meeting, the mother left feeling not only ignored but humiliated, as if she were to blame for her daughter's disappearance. This discrediting had devastating consequences. Without police support, official searches dwindled. Posters were removed from the streets, local newspaper articles stopped appearing, and little by little, the city began to move on. For neighbors, it was easier to believe the escape story than to face the possibility that something terrible could be happening right under their noses. Sarah's disappearance, which had initially mobilized the community, became a nuisance, a topic they preferred not to talk about. But the mother couldn't, even for a second, accept this silence. She knew something was very wrong. She memorized every strange detail, the noises coming from the barn, the overbought groceries, her grandfather's increasingly withdrawn behavior. But when she took this information to the police, she was treated like someone obsessed. "You have to move on," they said. "You can't spend your life stuck in something that may never have an answer." But how could she move on when her own daughter was missing? How could she accept the easy explanation that she had run away when her heart was screaming exactly the opposite? This conflict with the authorities not only isolated her but also drained her emotionally. She lost her job after missing days in a row, busy following false leads or knocking on doors for witnesses. Friends began to drift away, tired of the constant weight of her grief. Even family members began to avoid the subject, as if ignoring it were less painful than facing the tragedy. And through it all, her grandfather, Richard Thompson, remained there, unfazed, his expression hard and silent, as if he were just another victim of an ungrateful granddaughter who had abandoned him. This contrast was unbearable. The man who should have been the first to help in the search seemed the least interested in finding her. While the mother begged for support, Richard only reinforced the idea that Sarah had run away. He said little, but enough to reinforce in the minds of others the idea that there was no mystery. This coldness in the mother's eyes was almost a confession. But how could one accuse without proof? How could one convince the authorities that one's own grandfather could be involved in his granddaughter's disappearance? To the police, the idea was absurd. To her, it was the only one that made sense. The following years were marked by this constant clash. On one side, a mother determined not to let her daughter be forgotten. On the other, authorities who always repeated the same lazy explanation, as if they wanted to close the case once and for all. This discredit corroded her internally, but also fueled the flame of resistance. She couldn't give up. He kept newspaper clippings, police reports, notes from neighbors, all in a box he hid under his bed. It was his own research, carried out by force, without resources, without support, only with the strength of someone who refuses to believe the official version. And while her mother faced this wall of indifference, inside the barn, Sarah's life continued in oppressive silence. Outside, the world considered her missing. To the authorities, perhaps even dead or lost on some distant road. But the truth was, she was there, just a few feet away from everyone, hearing distant sounds of the city, smelling the damp earth after the rain, but never able to reach any of it. Every time her mother returned from the police station humiliated, every time a neighbor commented that she needed to get over it, Sarah was there, alive, waiting for someone to put together the pieces no one wanted to see. This was the biggest blow, not just the kidnapping itself, but the fact that those who were supposed to protect her failed to take the first step. If someone had listened to her mother from the beginning, if someone had looked more closely at the barn, if anyone had truly suspected that cold, silent man, perhaps Sarah wouldn't have spent 18 years imprisoned. But back then, no one wanted to see it, and with each passing day, the mother carried not only the pain of her absence, but also the frustration of fighting a system that insisted on ignoring her, a system that would rather close the case with a convenient explanation than admit that a monster might be living right in the heart of the community. She no longer trusted promises from authorities nor official investigations. All she had left was her intuition, that persistent voice telling her that Sarah was alive and that the truth was much closer than anyone imagined. And it was precisely this certainty, this refusal to accept the obvious, that would keep her going. Because one day, someone would realize she was right. One day, that locked door would open, and what lay behind it would shock everyone. But until then, her mother would continue fighting, alone, against an entire world that preferred to believe the comfortable lie rather than face the dark reality. There came a time when Sarah's mother realized there was nothing left to hope for from the police. Every time I walked through the police station doors, I received the same pitying looks, the same stock phrases, and the same insistence that I should move on. It was as if her pain were a nuisance, a burden no one wanted to carry. That hurt more than anything, but it also served as a trigger. If no one would look for her daughter, then she would do it alone. And so began a lonely journey, marked by sleepless nights, steps taken in the dark, and a determination that bordered on obsession. She bought old maps of the region, sketched possible routes, circled wooded areas, and marked points near her father's farm. She kept each clue in a box that grew increasingly heavy with notes, newspaper clippings, and accounts from neighbors. Often, she walked alone through the fields, braving the icy wind, hoping to find something forgotten, a scrap of clothing, a notebook, any object that would confirm what she already felt in her heart. Sarah hadn't run away. Sarah was nearby. These walks became frequent. While many residents preferred to ignore the incident, the mother walked the dirt roads with a flashlight in hand, illuminating every suspicious corner. She entered abandoned barns, searched sheds, and asked local workers if they had seen anything strange. In many of these encounters, she received evasive answers. Some claimed to have heard strange sounds, but quickly backed away, afraid of committing themselves. Others simply shook their heads, unwilling to challenge the respect and fear that Richard Thompson, her grandfather, still commanded in the community. She also began to observe her father more closely. Note that, even as he grew older, he maintained a strict routine, especially regarding the barn. He never let anyone near it. The place was always locked, with reinforced padlocks that he changed constantly. Sometimes, on quick visits, her mother would notice strange marks on the floor, as if heavy bags had been dragged inside. Other times, she noticed the smell of strong food, incompatible with the simple diet he claimed to have. Every detail was a silent warning, but without concrete evidence, it all sounded like paranoia to others. Still, she wouldn't give up. She spent hours reviewing old stories. She remembered the neighbor who swore she heard chains being dragged, the boy who, years ago, said he heard a female voice near the barn, her father's cold look whenever someone mentioned Sarah. They were loose ends, but in her mind they formed an increasingly clear picture. She was convinced the answer was there, so close it was suffocating. Over time, this solitary pursuit began to take its toll. She lost her job completely, as she was often absent or distracted. Her social life practically disappeared. Friends no longer invited her to anything, tired of hearing the same old talk about clues and suspects. Even close relatives began to avoid her, saying she had lost her balance. But for her, it wasn't madness. It was love. Love for a daughter who couldn't be forgotten. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, she wondered if she was going mad. But all she had to do was close her eyes and remember Sarah's shy smile, for all her strength to return. It was as if her daughter were calling to her, as if to say, "Don't give up on me." And that was enough for her to resume her search the next day, even alone, even against everyone's odds. And while this solitary battle raged inside the barn, Sarah continued to survive. Time passed slowly, each day dragged out by the monotony of silence and the pain of deprivation. But there were moments when she thought she heard footsteps outside, distant voices, the sound of a door opening somewhere on the farm. At those times, she screamed at the top of her lungs, banged on the walls, begged for help. But her screams never carried far. The isolation was perfect, calculated so that no one would hear. The cruelest thing of all was that the mother was so close, often walking around that same barn, watching her father from afar, unaware that her daughter was just a few feet away. What separated mother and daughter was not only a locked door, but also the invisible wall of disbelief, indifference, and fear in the community. This barrier kept the secret intact as the years continued to pass. And it was at this point that the mother made an even more drastic decision. She would trust no one else. She would pursue her investigation with ever greater intensity, writing down every detail, gathering every clue. She was ready to face even her own father alone, if necessary. But what she didn't know was that the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous everything became, because someone was willing to keep this secret buried at any cost. With each passing year, Sarah's mother's solitary search became an increasingly heavy, almost unbearable burden. She was no longer the same woman who had last seen her daughter leave home in 1995. Time had taken its toll on her body. Her eyes bore a profound weariness, and her mind oscillated between stubborn hope and utter despair. The obsession with finding her daughter took a heavy toll. Friends drifted away, family members avoided her, and even neighbors who had previously offered help began crossing the street to avoid hearing her broken voice once again talking about clues, maps, and suspects. Isolation became her new routine. Her job, which had already been shaken in the first few months, was definitively lost. She couldn't focus on anything other than her search. She spent sleepless nights scribbling in notebooks, reviewing every old story, returning to the same places dozens of times. She was often seen alone, walking the dirt roads with a flashlight, even in intense cold or storms. Many thought she had already lost her mind. For her, it was simply impossible to stop. How could she give up if she still felt her daughter was alive? This physical and emotional exhaustion worsened over time. The careless eating, irregular sleep, and lack of support caused her health to begin to show signs of collapse. Anxiety attacks would arise at random moments, and there were days when her body seemed unresponsive, yet she still insisted on going out, persisted in searching. There was something almost instinctive in this strength, the certainty that if she stopped, she would be abandoning Sarah forever. But perhaps the hardest blow was the judgment from the community itself. Many no longer saw her struggle as an act of love, but as an unhealthy obsession. They whispered that she couldn't accept reality, that she was trapped by a ghost. Some even insinuated that her daughter might have run away precisely because of her, as if the pain she carried was her fault. These words were like poison, slowly eroding her confidence. Deep down, she knew she wasn't crazy, but she couldn't escape the impact these accusations had. The emotional isolation became so great that, at times, she felt like she was living in a parallel world. While others moved on with their lives, marriages, children, stable jobs, she remained trapped in 1995. On that day, her daughter didn't come home. For her, time had stopped. The calendar moved forward, but her mind remained frozen in place, repeating the same unanswered question. Where was Sarah? And the cruelest thing was knowing that, while she suffered in silence, her grandfather continued his seemingly normal life. Richard Thompson walked around town as if nothing had happened, greeting neighbors, doing quick shopping, attending church on Sundays. To others, he was just an elderly man who had lost his granddaughter. To his mother, he was the center of all suspicion, the wall that stood between her and the truth. This forced coexistence, having to face her own father and pretend to a normality that didn't exist, was perhaps one of the greatest challenges she faced. But there was also a silent, slowly eroding internal weariness, guilt. She blamed herself every day for having allowed her daughter to visit her grandfather that last time. If only she had insisted that Sarah stay home, perhaps none of this would have happened. This guilt haunted her in every search, every failed attempt, every sleepless night. It wasn't just her daughter's absence that tormented her, but the idea that somehow she could have prevented it. And even with all this weight, she continued, alone, isolated, disbelieving, but unable to stop, because deep down, something told her the fight wasn't over yet, that there was something hidden, something that would one day come to light. And this conviction, even though it consumed her insides, was what kept her going. But the price of this path was becoming too high. With each passing day, Her strength waned, and the abyss of loneliness grew wider. And as she lost herself in this endless despair, the figure of the true antagonist began to take on clearer contours, even if no one around her wanted to see it. Richard Thompson, to outsiders, was just an old Colorado farmer. Quiet, religious, and meticulous in his habits, he seemed to carry with him the simple life of someone who had spent decades tending the land and cattle. He always wore the same worn clothes, dusty boots, and a worn hat that accompanied him wherever he went. To his neighbors, he was just an ordinary man, marked by the tragedy of losing his wife and later his granddaughter. Some even felt sorry for him, believing his cold and reserved manner was merely a reflection of the losses he bore. But behind this facade of normality lurked something much darker, something no one dared imagine. What few people realized was the intensity with which Richard controlled every detail of life around him. He was always strict with his family, especially his granddaughter. He wouldn't allow Sarah to express her opinions, disavowed her plans to study abroad, and had a hard look that would instantly silence any child. This behavior, which many dismissed as old-school rigidity, was actually a reflection of a mind that refused to lose control over anything. When his wife was still alive, she softened his harshness, transforming the house into a minimally welcoming place. But after her death, Richard became increasingly unpredictable, sinking into a silence that hid dangerous thoughts. It was precisely this banal appearance that made everything more frightening. Richard never raised his voice in public, never got into fights, never gave clear grounds for suspicion. It was as if he had learned to mask his own monstrosity with a calculated calm. The locked barn was seen as a habit of isolation. The excessive grocery shopping was justified as a solitary man's precaution. Every detail that might arouse suspicion was quickly swallowed up by the image he cultivated. Inside the barn, however, Sarah knew her grandfather's true face. He didn't shout, he didn't need to resort to loud violence. His cruelty was silent, methodical. He kept her under absolute control, restricting her freedom, her voice, her identity. Richard treated his granddaughter like a possession, something that belonged to him, and that he had chosen to keep hidden from the world. To him, Sarah was no longer a girl. She was an object of power, a reminder that he could still exert total dominion over someone. And perhaps the most disturbing thing was precisely this naturalness with which he imprisoned her. For Richard, this wasn't a crime, it was simply the order of things. This contrast between his public image and the reality hidden inside the barn was what allowed him to keep his secret for so long. While Sarah's mother screamed for justice and begged for an investigation, Richard walked the city streets as if nothing had happened. He spoke little, but enough to keep up appearances. He never showed genuine suffering, but his coldness was interpreted as his way of dealing with pain. And so, year after year, the monster remained invisible, hidden behind the mask of the common man. The scariest thing is that even when rumors arose, even when someone claimed to have heard strange noises in the barn, no one dared confront him. It was as if his austere and silent figure commanded a respect that blocked any suspicion. This cloak of normalcy was his greatest disguise, the armor that kept him untouched for nearly 2 decades. And while the town slept, believing the story of a teenage escape, Sarah remained inside, living under the thumb of a man who seemed incapable of remorse. A man who, to the world, was just another grandfather scarred by tragedy, but who in reality was the man responsible for it. And it was this duplicity, this double life of Richard's, that would become the centerpiece of one of the community's greatest horrors. Because the more time passed, the more he believed he would never be discovered, until the day everything began to crumble. The cruelest and most devastating blow didn't come from a false lead or the community's suffocating silence. It came disguised as hope. Years after Sarah's disappearance, when her mother was physically exhausted, emotionally drained, And living practically on the margins of her own life, an anonymous call arrived at her home. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who spoke quickly, nervously, but confident enough to convince her he knew something important. He claimed to have seen a young woman who looked very much like Sarah in a nearby town at a homeless shelter. The description seemed to match what her daughter might have looked like years later. Thinner, with long, unkempt hair, but with the same clear eyes that no one could forget. For the mother, it was like a breath of life after so long breathing only pain. Without a second thought, she gathered what little money she had left and set off for the city. The journey was long, crossing dirt roads, stretches of highway, and endless hours of anxiety. With every kilometer traveled, she clung to the hope that she would finally be reunited with her daughter. She remembered Sarah's shy smile, the way she hid behind her books, and allowed herself to imagine, even if only for a moment, the reunion she had longed for. Once there, he roamed the shelter with his heart racing. He watched every face, every look, every gesture, expecting to spot Sarah at any moment. But the truth soon imposed itself brutally. The young woman described was not there. The supposed resemblance was nothing more than a coincidence. There were no clues, no information, nothing. It was all just empty hope, an involuntary or perhaps intentional cruelty that threw her back into the abyss of grief. The disappointment was so great that for the first time in years, the mother felt the weight of defeat almost unbearably. She returned home with no money, no answers, and an even greater pain than before. That night, she sat alone in the dark kitchen, her phone on the table, silent, and cried like she hadn't in a long time. She cried not only for her daughter's absence, but for the feeling of being completely alone in her struggle, with no one to believe in her, no support, no direction. Meanwhile, inside the barn, Sarah remained alive, completely oblivious to the desperate search taking place outside. Perhaps, at some point, she had felt in her heart that her mother was still trying, still believing. But reality was relentless. Every hope she nurtured turned into a new wound. This personal blow not only shook the mother, but also affected the way the community viewed her. Some began to say she had completely lost touch with reality. Others used that frustration as proof they had been right all along. The girl ran away and she can't accept it. This indifference, coupled with the pain of failure, nearly destroyed her completely. But, paradoxically, it was also at this point of greatest weakness that something shifted within her. The profound disappointment rekindled the flame of resistance. It was as if the pain had made it clear that there was no longer room for illusions. The truth would not be handed to her on a silver platter. She would have to dig. Face it, resist until the end. Even if hope came disguised as cruelty, she could not give up, because somewhere Sarah was still waiting for her. And as this internal struggle unfolded, a new phase of the search was about to begin. A phase marked not only by desperation, but by the blind obstinacy of those who had nothing left to lose. And it was precisely at this moment that something unexpected began to stir, bringing with it the promise that the silence would not last forever. Sarah's mother's desperate search became even more intense, almost obsessive, after the cruel blow of the false clue. If she had previously walked alone, now she lived for it. Her house became a kind of makeshift headquarters. The living room walls were covered in scribbled maps, red lines connecting unlikely locations, newspaper clippings pasted side by side, notebooks full of notes scattered on the table. It was as if she were putting together a puzzle that made sense only to her, but each piece was treated as a key capable of unlocking the door to the truth. She began retracing her daughter's steps. She visited Sarah's school, spoke with former classmates, and tried to retrieve memories that might indicate something that had gone unnoticed. She kept even the smallest details, like stray phrases from friends, her daughter's simple habits, anything that might point to where she had gone, or rather, where she might have been taken. She even spent nights in libraries, consulting files on similar disappearances in neighboring towns, comparing dates and circumstances, searching for patterns. But what tormented her were the signs that always appeared near the same place, her father's farm, the locked barn. There were old reports from neighbors about strange noises, footsteps, and chains at night. Some farm workers swore they'd seen Richard carrying heavy bags into the barn at unlikely hours. Others spoke of a flashlight shining inside the shed, even in the early hours of the morning. But every time she reported this information to the police, she received the same cold response. They were just rumors. "You're seeing things where nothing exists," they said. Faced with the authorities' inaction, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a used camera and began discreetly recording her father's movements. She spent hours hidden in strategic locations, observing from afar whenever he approached the barn. She saw him dragging large bags inside more than once, but the photos weren't clear enough to prove anything. She also noticed that on certain days he spent more time than usual inside the barn, locked inside, and only emerged after sunset. It all seemed to scream truth, but there was still no concrete proof. This effort began to consume what little remained of her life. Jobless, friendless, living only on the sporadic help of people who felt sorry for her, she devoted every minute to the search. She often stayed up all night, spreading documents across the table, tracing new lines on maps, always returning to the same spot, the farm. Often she would drive there in the middle of the night, park at a distance, and watch in silence, her heart racing, hoping to spot something that might confirm her suspicions. Each failed attempt was a punch in the gut. Every time she thought she'd found a real clue, reality cruelly imposed itself, showing her there was nothing, or that there was no way to prove it. But still, she couldn't stop. It was as if an inner voice kept repeating, night after night, that Sarah was there, waiting, and that she couldn't give up. Inside, Sarah felt the echoes of that search without ever knowing it. There were nights when she thought she heard different noises, closer footsteps, even a car parked somewhere down the road. At those times she screamed, banged on the walls, begged for help, but the isolation was perfect. The barn seemed built so that its sounds would be lost in the wind, never reaching anyone. Most cruel of all, mother and daughter were often separated by just a few feet of wood and silence. The desperate search became an endless routine, a cycle of hope and frustration that repeated itself day after day. For the mother, it was impossible to stop because each attempt, no matter how painful, brought her closer to the truth. But this same search was pushing her ever closer to the edge, pushing her to a point of no return. And it was in this scenario of exhaustion and despair that something even more painful happened, because, amid all her attempts to find her daughter, she would once again face disbelief, not only from the authorities, but from people who would become direct obstacles in her fight. Frustration reached a new level when, after years of accumulating clues, notes, and suspicions, Sarah's mother decided to summon the courage and once again take everything she had to the authorities. She believed that now, with so many observations about her father's behavior, excessive purchases, strange movements in the barn, and reports from neighbors, someone would finally listen. She entered the police station, carrying a briefcase crammed with documents, notebooks, and secretly taken photos. She sat down across from the officer in charge and began to speak, revealing every detail, every note, every coincidence that, to her, was no coincidence at all. But instead of interest, she received weary looks and dismissive smiles. The police officer flipped through the papers nonchalantly, as if he simply wanted to end the conversation. And then came the sentence that shattered her insides. "We understand your pain, but you must accept that your daughter ran away. There's no evidence of foul play here, only suspicions fueled by your imagination." It was as if years of struggle, sleepless nights, and shattered hopes had been reduced to one word: hysteria. Worse than the indifference was the way they began to treat her. At each visit to the police station, she was met with impatience, as if she were a burden interfering with their actual work. Some officers began calling her the crazy woman with the missing girl when they thought she couldn't hear. Others insinuated that she needed medical help, not police help. That hurt more than any silence. It was as if, besides losing her daughter, she was also losing her own credibility, her dignity. This lack of support not only prevented her from moving forward, but also directly hindered her efforts. On one occasion, she requested permission to investigate areas near her father's farm with independently hired sniffer dogs, but the police blocked her initiative, claiming that, without a court order, this would constitute trespassing. Once again, the law served not to protect, but to shield the culprit. The same culprit who walked freely through the city, greeting neighbors, attending church, and keeping his mask intact. The mother's desperation reached such a point that she tried to organize a search on her own with the help of volunteers. She managed to gather a few kind-hearted people, but was soon thwarted. The police arrived on the scene and shut down the entire operation, stating that the obsession was disrupting the community order. It wasn't enough to not help. Now they were hindering it. Outside, her image deteriorated further. The town, once supportive, began to see her as a nuisance. Some said she was going crazy, that she no longer knew how to separate reality from fantasy. Others criticized her for not leaving her father alone, accusing her of stalking an elderly man who had also suffered the loss of his granddaughter. The cruelty of these words crushed her, but nothing could make her back down. Meanwhile, inside the barn, Sarah continued to hear the distant echoes of life outside. Often, when her mother tried to approach the farm, her granddaughter could feel the presence, albeit invisible. She screamed, banged on the walls, but the perfect isolation made her voice nothing more than a whisper lost in the night. The cruel shock was that, just as her mother got closer to the truth, she was stopped by the police, by her neighbors, by the very system she was supposed to protect. This new blockage not only increased the pain, but also the feeling of powerlessness. It was as if the truth were there, within reach, and yet greater forces were rising to keep it buried. Forces that perhaps were more dangerous than silence itself. And it was at that moment of near give-up, at that point where there seemed no way out, that something unexpected began to emerge. An unlikely source of help, coming from where no one expected it, would change the course of history and rekindle the flame of hope that had almost been extinguished forever. It was when all seemed lost, when Sarah's mother was already exhausted by grief, disbelief, and closed doors, that life threw an unlikely helping hand her way. It didn't come from expensive lawyers, nor renowned investigators, much less from the police, who had so often ridiculed her. It came from where no one expected, from ordinary people, who began to realize there was something deeply wrong with the story everyone pretended not to see. The first step happened by chance, one autumn afternoon, when two farmhands hired to do minor repairs on old Richard's farm commented on strange noises coming from the barn. One swore he heard muffled crying, the other spoke of knocking that seemed to be coming from inside. Both, frightened, laughed nervously and dropped the subject, but a nearby neighbor overheard the conversation and, disturbed, discreetly sought out Sarah's mother. It wasn't proof, but it was the spark she needed to keep going. Shortly thereafter, a local volunteer firefighter, who knew her story and sympathized with her suffering, decided to offer help. He explained that he had access to simple equipment, such as powerful flashlights and two-way radios, and that he could accompany her on discreet searches. It wouldn't be official, it wouldn't be legal, but it would be real. For the first time in years, she felt she wasn't completely alone. Soon others joined in. A former schoolmate of Sarah's, now an adult, offered to map nearby areas using drones borrowed from a friend. an elderly neighbor who for years had kept her discomfort with the farm's nighttime noises to herself, finally summoned the courage to hand over a notebook filled with secret notes, dates, and times when she had heard strange things coming from the barn. These were just personal records, but together they began to form an increasingly solid picture. This unexpected alliance gave Sarah's mother new life. For the first time, she wasn't carrying that unbearable weight alone. There were people who believed her, who validated her suspicions, who saw the same pattern she'd been trying to demonstrate for years. They weren't authorities, they weren't official investigators, but they were. Attentive eyes and ears, willing to take risks. With this small group, new strategies were developed. They began discreetly watching the farm, taking turns in improvised shifts. They sat in cars parked at a distance, used binoculars, and recorded unusual movements. Gradually, they began gathering more consistent information. They noticed that Richard always entered the barn on the same days of the week, at similar times, and that he remained inside much longer than any task warranted. The feeling that something big was about to be discovered began to grow. The mother, even exhausted, felt a spark of hope burning within her again. But along with that hope came fear, because the more they watched, the clearer it became that something was about to be revealed. And when that moment came, there would be no turning back. It was only a matter of time before the barn door opened. And what was hidden inside would change everything forever. The day that would forever change the family's. History began mundanely, as if it were just another morning on Richard Thompson's farm. The sun hadn't even fully risen when 2 workers hired to renovate the property arrived to begin work. The old man was increasingly frail with age and could no longer maintain the wooden structures alone, which threatened to collapse over time. The barn, in particular, needed urgent repairs. Richard, as always, insisted that no one enter, saying that it was dangerous, unstable, and could collapse. But that day, his authority wasn't enough. The men began inspecting the area and quickly realized something wasn't right. The barn doors were reinforced with thick chains and heavy padlocks, far beyond what was necessary for a simple tool shed. It was as if the place were more of a fortress than a lumber yard. Intrigued, the workers approached. It was at that moment that they heard the first sound, a low, almost whimpering noise coming from inside. They looked at each other suspiciously, believing it. Might be a trapped animal. They knocked on the door and called out, but the sound abruptly ceased, as if whoever was inside had been swallowed by the silence. They decided to break in. Using work tools, they forced the padlocks until the wood gave way with a sharp snap. What they found next froze everyone's blood. There, in a dark corner, huddled like a human shadow, was Sarah. No longer the 14-year-old girl who had disappeared in 1995, but a grown woman, 32, her body marked by extreme thinness, her long, tangled hair covering part of her face, and her wide eyes that trembled in the sudden light. The scene was indescribable. The workers stood paralyzed for a few seconds, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Sarah was breathing heavily, as if she couldn't believe it was real. She tried to stand, but her legs, frail and accustomed to the confined space, barely held her up. One of the men, trembling, ran to help her, while the other ran off, frantically, to call the police. Inside the barn, the horror was even greater. The space had been transformed into a makeshift prison. There was an old mattress on the floor, a bucket used as a toilet, and food scraps scattered on makeshift shelves. The thick, reinforced walls prevented any sound from escaping. It was as if the place had been designed to hide a secret forever. When Sarah finally stepped out the door, the fresh air hit her face like a blade. Her eyes filled with tears, not just from the physical pain, but from the shock of seeing the sky open after 18 years of darkness. The workers, still in shock, covered her with a jacket and carried her outside. She didn't speak, only mumbling incoherent sentences, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a struggle to believe she was truly free. The news spread within hours. The police, now left with no other choice, appeared in force, surrounding the farm, collecting evidence and attempting to justify years of inaction. Incredulous neighbors gathered outside, many of them unable to face the reality that for nearly 2 decades a young woman had been imprisoned right before their eyes. Richard Thompson was found at home, sitting in his usual chair, with the same cold expression he wore every day. He didn't try to escape, showed no remorse, or say a single word. He simply stared blankly at the officers, as if unable to comprehend the gravity of what he had done. For him, the secret had been kept for 18 years, and perhaps he believed it would never be discovered. But that day, the truth finally came out. Sarah had survived, against all odds, against all the silence, against all the indifference. She emerged from the barn, bearing not only the physical marks of captivity, but emotional scars that would never be erased. Reunion with her mother was still to come, but at that moment, the most important thing was that the door had been opened, and with it, the chance to begin again. But along with liberation came a disturbing question. How could so many signs have been ignored for so long? And what was left now for a woman who had lost nearly 2 decades of her life in a world of darkness? Sarah's reunion with her mother was a moment no one present could ever forget. When the news of the rescue reached her, her mother could hardly believe it. After 18 years of hearing only silence, 18 years of being called crazy, 18 years of carrying everyone's guilt and disbelief on her shoulders, someone finally said in a firm voice, "She's alive." At first, the shock was so great that her body became unresponsive. Her legs gave out, the air left her chest, and she needed to be held. It was as if her soul had left her body for a moment to confirm that this wasn't just another of the many false hopes she had faced. When she was taken to the hospital where Sarah was receiving care, the corridor seemed endless. Each step was accompanied by memories of her little daughter, her shy smile, her dreamy demeanor. At the same time, fear consumed her. How was Sarah? What was left of her after so many years imprisoned? The mother felt torn between the hope of a reunion and the dread of finding a stranger instead of the daughter she had lost. And then the door opened. In the room, Sarah sat on a bed, wrapped in blankets, her long, tousled hair falling over her face. Hesitantly, she looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. There was a second of absolute silence, as if the world had stopped to wait. The two stared at each other, as if recognizing a part of themselves long lost. It was the mother who took the first step, crossing the room in tears and hugging her daughter with the strength of someone who had dreamed of this moment for almost 2 decades. It took Sarah a few seconds to respond. Her fragile body trembled, accustomed only to the cold of isolation, but gradually she let herself be enveloped. She cried too, not tears of immediate joy, but heavy tears, laden with everything she had lived and lost. It wasn't just a reunion. It was the explosion of years of pain, silence, fear, and pent-up love. The room was filled with an emotion that broke even the toughest. Doctors, nurses, police officers, everyone lowered their heads or discreetly wiped their eyes. It was impossible not to feel the weight of that scene. Mother and daughter reunited after so long, but with scars that could never be erased. For the mother, that hug was proof that she had never been wrong. All the years of disbelief, all the humiliation, all the sleepless nights had been worth it. She had always known, deep in her heart, that Sarah was alive, and now she had her daughter back in her arms. For Sarah, that touch meant more than words could explain. It was the first true sign that the nightmare was over, that there was someone waiting for her, someone who had never given up. But even amid the tears and relief, the pain was also present. The lost time was an abyss, impossible to ignore. Sarah was no longer the 14-year-old girl who had disappeared, and her mother was no longer the young woman who had desperately searched for her. They were two survivors of a tragedy that had changed them forever. Their reunion was both victory and mourning. Victory for the life rescued, mourning for the years stolen. In that moment, no words were spoken. Only the silence of the embrace spoke louder than anything. A silence that was no longer that of absence, but of catharsis, of liberation, of the silent promise that from then on, even with scars, they would walk together again. But while this moment of hope unfolded inside the hospital, outside the community began to face an uncomfortable truth. For years, they had ignored the signs, disbelieved the mother, and turned a blind eye to the evidence. Now they would have to deal with the guilt of having allowed a young woman to spend 18 years in captivity, just meters away from everyone. And amidst the crying and the hugs, a new question arose, dark and inevitable. How to move forward after surviving the impossible? The outcome of Sarah Thompson's story wasn't like the movies, where everything resolves into tears of joy and happy endings. Reuniting with her mother brought relief, brought hope, but also exposed wounds that could never be healed. After 18 years trapped in a barn, Sarah was no longer the 14-year-old girl who had disappeared. She was a grown woman, marked by invisible scars, with an entire youth stolen from her by her own grandfather. The world she was rediscovering was strange, noisy, full of colors and movements that seemed violent to someone accustomed to absolute silence. Every step outside the hospital was accompanied by fear and distrust. Even sunlight, so simple and banal to anyone, was almost unbearable for her to face. The mother, for her part, was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. The embrace in the hospital had validated her struggle, shown her that she had never been wrong, that all the disbelief she had endured was nothing more than a cruel mistake. But along with the victory also came an unbearable weight: how to make up for lost time, how to rebuild the life of a daughter whose adolescence, youth and freedom were ripped away. The two were united again, but they were at the same time two strangers trying to recognize each other after nearly 2 decades, separated by a wall of pain. Richard Thompson was arrested without resistance. He sat in the dock with the same coldness with which he had spent years, pretending to be just a grieving grandfather. She didn't cry, didn't defend herself, didn't show remorse. For the community, the shock was devastating. The man many respected, with whom they exchanged greetings and entrusted with small tasks, was the same man who had held his granddaughter captive for 18 years. The streets of the small town filled with indignation, but also with shame. Shame for having believed the easy excuses, for having discredited the mother, for having chosen the comfort of lies over the pain of the truth. The trial brought headlines, cameras and journalists who turned the case into national news. But for Sarah and her mother, there was no victory in seeing Richard convicted. His imprisonment wouldn't restore the lost years, wouldn't erase the nights of despair, wouldn't heal the open wounds. All that remained was the bitter certainty that he would never again have power over them. In the end, Sarah's story became a symbol of the resilience of a mother who never gave up, even when everyone doubted her, a symbol of the cruelty hidden behind seemingly harmless faces, a symbol of how entire communities can be complicit by remaining silent in the face of what they refuse to see, and above all, a symbol of survival, because despite everything, Sarah was alive. But living after surviving is also a challenge. Sarah would have to relearn how to exist in a world that had moved on without her. She would have to deal with the weight of being, remembered not only as a victim, but as the woman who endured the unimaginable. Her mother would have to learn to release the invisible chains that kept her trapped in the search, now transforming her energy into reconstruction. Together, they would have to face the future, carrying not only the pain, but also the strength of having resisted the impossible. In the silence of the days that followed, far from the media frenzy, mother and daughter sat side by side again, often without saying a word. No words could bridge the chasm left by time, but there was presence, there was touch, there was the promise of never losing each other again. And even with the scars that would never fade, that presence was, in itself, a form of victory. And that was how Sarah Thompson's story ended for the world, but not for her. Because with every glance at the open sky, every breath of fresh air, every step outside the wooden walls that had imprisoned her for 18 years, she carried within her the memory of the horror, and living proof that however long and cruel the darkness, there is always the possibility of a new dawn. Stories like Sarah's show how silence can hide unimaginable secrets, and how the truth, when revealed, moves us deeply. This content made you delve into every detail, feel the tension of each moment, and experience the emotion of reunion. Now you can help others learn about this story by liking and subscribing to the channel. This way, more people will feel the same impact you felt here today. Write the word strength in the comments to show that you reached the end of this narrative and believe in the resistance of those who survive the impossible. And remember, Sarah's story is just one of many that still need to be told. The next video is already here, packed with mystery, suspense, and even more intense twists. Click now and join me on this journey, because each new chapter holds secrets that will surprise you even more than the one you just watched.